Hello, and welcome to the How to Make a Podcast podcast. My name is Casey Ruff from Boundless Body LLC, and I am the host of Boundless Body Radio. Before October of 2020, I was not a podcaster. Now, I have recorded hundreds of episodes featuring incredible guests, created tons of helpful content, and have consistently generated thousands of downloads every month since I began. I'm just a regular dude trying to share a message, and now I'm ready to show you my process, my successes and failures, and everything I've learned along the way to help you start your own podcast. Together, we'll explore the entire process of having a podcasting idea and take it all the way to publishing your first episode and explore all the steps in between. Then, I'll give you all the tools that you will need so you can record as many episodes that you want to release after that. Podcasting is one of the most enriching skills I've ever added to my life, and I've learned a ton by talking with some of my heroes and sharing it with anyone who wants to join us on our journey. So, sit back, grab a notebook, take some notes, and welcome to the How to Make a Podcast podcast. Hello, this is Casey Ruff, and welcome to episode 4 of season 2. Today we are going to be speaking with Steven Dimmitt. Steven is the host of the Nugget Climbing Podcast. He was hosted on our primary podcast, so be sure to go and check out that episode. It was so good. His amazing story about rock climbing and podcasting, living in a van, chasing his dreams. It's a really cool story, and that's back on episode 136 of Boundless Body Radio. Steven, welcome to the How to Make a Podcast podcast.
Thank you, Casey. Good to be back here with you.
Absolutely.
Same host, different podcast.
Yeah, totally. Not a podcast I ever thought I would do or wanted to do. It just kind of came to me one day and had it all planned out within about 30 seconds. So I figure must be a calling.
Oh, that's awesome. I wonder if you feel this way. I actually love talking about this topic. So I'm looking forward to this. I think this will be really fun.
Absolutely.
I can geek out about this stuff all day.
Great. That's why you were one of the very first people I reached out to. Just your purity and, reasons for doing your podcast, I just think are so cool. And I think you'll be an amazing guest. Before we deep dive into that, I asked you on Boundless Body when we had our episode, where in the world were you? And said it was a totally fair question. And I still think it's a totally fair question. Where in the world are you right now?
It still is a fair question. I live on the road full time. For people that haven't listened to that episode, I live in a 2014 ProMaster van. My van is named Poe after the movie Kung Fu Panda.
Nice.
That's a new development. That name finally connected for me. It's always hard to name a vehicle, but when you find the right name, it's just like serendipity.
It just fits. Same with my bikes, but I have to wait.
Your bikes?
Yeah, I have to wait to get a name for the bikes, but when they come, it's great.
It has to feel right. But yeah, to answer you, I am in Joes Valley, Utah, and that's a really amazing bouldering area in Utah in the United States, and I'm staying with a friend of mine at an Airbnb right now. So I'm actually sitting inside a house for once.
Nice. Good for you.
Taking showers regularly. It's novel
awesome.
Experience.
Good for you. Enjoy it while you have it. Where is Joes Valley? Is that central Utah?
It's about 2 to 3 hours south, slightly west of Salt Lake City.
Gotcha. Well, I could have just loaded up my stuff and we could have done this in person. 2-hour drive. It's not bad.
Yeah, dang. Yeah. Are you in Salt Lake? I forget.
Yep. Just outside of Salt Lake.
Okay.
Yep. Yeah. Beautiful area. It's awesome. Oh man. So we are going to be talking about podcasting and kind of your, the equipment that you use and the software you use and all your process and everything in between. But before we dive into the brass tacks of things, I really want to hammer the why of podcasting. Is something I think is really important that a lot of podcasters don't necessarily consider. And I have to say, you of all people have one of the purest whys ever. Why do you have the podcast that you have?
Thank you for saying that. For me, it just goes back to I'm really scratching my own itch with the podcast. And again, for people that haven't heard our other conversation, I was an engineer. I was stuck in a cubicle 40 hours a week for several years working in aerospace back in Oregon, where I lived at the time. And I listened to podcasts incessantly. I learned so much from them, connecting with these amazing mentors that I got to listen to in these conversations on the Tim Ferriss show and on Joe Rogan and Armchair Expert, some of my favorite podcasts. They really started to impact me. And I just really wanted to, I could envision a podcast in the context of climbing that provided that same sort of mentorship for myself and for other people listening. And I just wanted to, there was a podcast that I wanted to listen to that didn't exist. And it finally clicked that I could make it. And there was no reason why I shouldn't make it, that no one else was going to. So, why not try? And that's been my philosophy from the start. And a lot of people are listening now. And I'm always kind of balancing, what I think will be valuable in these conversations for my listeners. But at the heart of every conversation that I have, at the heart of every question that I ask my guests, it's really my personal interest that I'm scratching. It's that personal itch that I'm trying to scratch with this. And it just so happens that a lot of people are resonating with my curiosity and they have the same questions. And so it's amazing. It's serving a lot more people than I had ever imagined that it would. But it's the most fun thing I've ever done, because every week I get to sit down with someone who I genuinely am fascinated by, really want to talk to, and I just get to ask them all my most burning questions about them and their life and about their rock climbing. And I'm just trying to extract everything I possibly can to learn from them for myself. So yeah, it's still just as fun as ever. I love doing it.
So if you didn't have a single listener beside yourself, would you continue podcasting?
I would. I would. Yeah. I think it'd be a little harder to get some of these guests that I've had on. It definitely helps to have the credibility. I think that's something that's a main message that I like to share for people is when you build something like this, it's like when you connect with this idea that really resonates with you and it's you leaning into, something authentic that you're excited about, and that connects with other people. It can really feel like pushing a giant snowball down a hill, and it's just growing and growing. And, nowadays I have a lot of guests reaching out to listeners reaching out to guests that they want to have on the show and saying like, why haven't you been on the Nugget yet? And I tell you what, that goes a really long way, as far as creating credibility and allowing you to grow your network and connect with some of these people that feel intimidating or unreachable. So
wow.
I would still do it, but it's amazing. It's amazing, and it makes a huge difference to have so much support from listeners. Yeah.
Wow. That was the interesting thing that was kind of unfolding as we were doing our interview. I felt like I had done quite a bit of research on you and what your philosophy was and, kind of how you were managing things. And, for a lot of people, ourselves included, like this is kind of the side thing that we do. I can only really do this because I have clients that I train normally in the mornings. Then in the afternoons, I can set up afternoons and talk with whoever I want and record it and post it. But it's just so different when that's kind of the secondary thing. And I love it, but that's not my bread and butter. That's not where I'm making any money. And I just assumed that the podcast was like, same for you, kind of side hustle. You're doing your engineering gig. Maybe it's part-time. Maybe you're working on the road. And then you're also doing the podcast. But for you, it was just pure, this is what I want to do. And I'm just going to do it. And it's done. And you're right. It's like growing and building listeners. Like that's, I don't know. That's just so cool to me.
Yeah. Thank you. I mean, I made that choice I basically just decided to save up for a sabbatical. I mean, that was my approach with it. I still had my engineering job. I saved up a lot of money. I bought a van. I had always dreamed of doing that on its own anyway. I had dreamed of, I told myself, I think when I was in my early 20s, that by the time I turned 30 years old, I would move into a van and travel for a year and rock climb full time. That's every climber's daydream, right? And the timing finally felt right when I had this idea for this podcast and this other thing that I wanted to do, because you can't climb every day. You need rest days, and living on the road and climbing can actually feel pretty empty if you don't have something else to balance that with, at least for me. And so it felt really right to have some creative work to pour myself into, something that felt a little bit more giving, a little bit more meaningful, a little bit less self-focused than just rock climbing. So I had enough money to commit to it for a year, and I honestly had no idea if it would work. I just figured it was after one of my early conversations that I had with one of my heroes. I just remember leaving that conversation. It was Alan Watts, for people that have listened to the podcast, episode 4. And I went out to lunch with him. We hadn't recorded anything yet. And I just remember leaving that conversation, that lunch with him, and just thinking, if no one listens to this, this is going to be the most fun I've ever had. So it was really easy to get excited about it and to just treat it like my full-time job. And I wanted to take it really seriously, but I didn't need it to work. I had enough money saved up to be on the road for a year. And I thought maybe I'd end up going back to engineering after that, or I was starting to kind of, traveling. I would ask people questions like, how are you making this lifestyle work? And I got kind of interested in rope access work, because I know a lot of climbers that do that seasonally, and they can really focus, part of their year on making money and then sustain that lifestyle the rest of the year. So I definitely, I feel really lucky that it all worked out. I definitely did not expect it to. I guess the last thing I would add to that is I think it really does make a big difference in the product, in the amount of momentum that you can build if you do give it your full attention. Because there's a lot of good podcasts out there, and a lot of people do what you're doing, and they have to sustain their or maintain their normal job, and they're doing the podcast on the side. I think it's hard. It's hard to do both. It's hard to put enough energy into both for the podcast to get over that tipping point, where it starts to take off and build that momentum on its own. So I think that's been a huge advantage for me, that I gave myself the space and the time to really pour everything into it.
I love that. That's awesome. So pure. So tell us again the name of your podcast, and why did you choose the format that you chose?
Yeah, it's called the Nugget Climbing Podcast. You can find it everywhere that podcasts are found. Just type in the Nugget and you'll find it. I didn't have to think that hard about it. I just always listened to long form interviews. I always have found the uncut, raw, conversational style podcast to be the most engaging and fascinating. I really also enjoy the more radio journalism, more produced episodes from, I've listened to Death, Sex, and Money and Radiolab and things along those lines. There's a couple climbing podcasts that kind of do that too. They're more journalism pieces. Maybe there's snippets of interviews kind of sprinkled in, but they're telling a more crafted story. And I think that's cool, but it's just not what I found myself listening to all day. So I really loved listening to the long form interviews, and that was just kind of always what I was going to do. I didn't really sit down and, pick that. It just was the thing that I envisioned, because it was what I was drawn to as a listener.
What is something that initially you maybe felt like was really kind of important that over time you realized wasn't as important as you thought?
Oh, that's a really good question. Because I'm an engineer, I'm incredibly detail oriented. I guess I should start with that. And that is a double-edged sword. It served me in a lot of ways. It's a huge asset for me, but it can also cut the other way and be really debilitating. And early on, I was very much a perfectionist with editing. I would spend hours and hours going through my episodes minute by minute and nitpicking them and cutting out all the filler words and trying to tighten up my conversations. And I've just relaxed a lot as far as that goes. And I've realized that, there is some line between the conversation being distracting because of pauses or because of awkward moments or things like that. Like, you do want to get rid of that stuff if you can. But there's also something so human about, getting to know someone's personality and their vocal tics, and being able to hear that they're nervous and then they loosen up over the course of the interview. Like, that stuff's actually really cool. And that's one of my favorite things about long form interviews, is feeling like you're sitting there with the person. So I've relaxed a lot as far as the editing, and I spend a lot less time scrutinizing the content and the episodes. Just a less fine resolution, I guess, nowadays. And I'm more okay with just letting things flow a little bit more.
Yeah, the pause that you sometimes get while the guest is thinking and they don't say so it just becomes this like awkward 3 or 4 or 5 second kind of silence. It feels like it's longer than it truly is, but it's like you said, it's kind of that human element of like the person's just considering what you asked and they're trying to form a really good response. And that's not necessarily something to be attacked in the editing process. You can kind of leave that in. That's something I used to edit all the time and I rarely do now.
Right. Same. Yeah, same.
Interesting. What are you using to actually do editing?
I use Logic Pro X. So I have a MacBook Pro and so I upgraded to Logic Pro X probably 6 months ago. And I really love using that. But I will say, talking about equipment, talking about software, things like that for people, there's, the question to ask yourself is what is good enough? And for people listening, I used GarageBand, which is completely free with a MacBook or a MacBook Pro. I used GarageBand for my first 40 plus episodes. And I would guess that most people wouldn't be able to hear the difference between my current episodes and my older ones. I think the sound quality has improved slightly. And there's a lot of tricks that I use in Logic that I really appreciate because it gives me a little bit more latitude. Like I don't have to be in the perfect recording space. I can take care of some of that stuff in post, get rid of background noises and echoes and things like that. But you don't have to have anything fancy. So yeah, I think GarageBand was totally fine. I upgraded to Logic. I also have a background in music production and audio engineering stuff from my music major. So I've started to do some podcast coaching now and had some consultations with people. And I've realized that there's absolutely no right or wrong way. And I think the most important thing is being honest with yourself and figuring out like what sounds fun to you. Where's the line? What sounds like work? What sounds like a chore? And for me, the audio production side, I really enjoy and I totally geek out about it. And I think it's really fun. And if that's not you, there's amazing resources out there nowadays. These one-stop softwares that kind of package the episodes for you. And I think the key thing is just make sure that it sounds good enough that the audio quality is not distracting to the listener. And if you accomplish that, which I think is pretty easy to do, then it's all about content. The content is so much more important than the sound quality. And chasing those few extra percentage points of sound quality is totally fine if you feel excited about that. But if it sounds like, oh my God, that's what a nightmare. That sounds like my worst, that's not something I want to do, then just find a way to not do it.
Yeah, that's great. That's great advice. I actually didn't know that about you. I knew you were into music, but I didn't know you had any editing background. What are some of when you're doing coaching with people, what are some of the really like basic things that people should know when they're first getting started?
That's a really good question. I think, something that I talk about a lot with people, because I feel like it's been the key part of my podcast being as successful as it's been, and being as sustainable as it's been, is just to create the show that you want to listen to and try to find. You used the word pure earlier. I'll say it this way. I've had a couple conversations with people who are really struggling. They're like, I don't quite know what I want to do with this thing. And I would honestly say, this might feel negative for some people, but if you don't really want to make a specific thing, then I wouldn't do it. I think you can keep looking, you can keep thinking about it until you find that idea that feels really pure to you or that really resonates deeply with you. But in my experience, you have to want to make the show that you're making. And if you want to make it for its own sake, it's going to be so much better, so much more sustainable, so much easier to show up week after week and put out episodes than if you're trying to come up with an idea that you think people will like.
Yeah, we could not agree more. We actively encourage people to quit early if it doesn't pan out to be something that you really truly enjoy. Somebody that doesn't have, the why that you have, they don't have that same North Star that's going to guide them when the going gets tough. Like sometimes it's not that easy to keep inviting people. Sometimes it's not that easy to do the editing. And, all these things are skills that take time to learn and build and grow. And we couldn't agree more. Like if you don't have a good reason or a good idea, it's probably just not quite ready. It's not quite your thing. Or if you do this and you find that you've done 5 episodes and you're so concerned with the downloads, or monetizing or something, like, I don't know that this is right for you, really. Would you agree?
Yeah, I think so. And that actually reminds me of another thing that I find myself talking about often, which is, I can't remember who shared this quote with me, but basically make sure that the first time you do something isn't the first time you do something. So go through the whole entire process of the podcast, basically do a bunch of practice episodes, record some episodes with your friends, or if you're doing a solo podcast, just make a couple practice episodes that you do not at all intend to publish and see if you like it. You will learn so much from going through that process. Your first episodes will be better than they would otherwise have been because you've already done it before. And it gives you a chance to really feel things out. Like, is this fun? What parts of it do I need to work on? What parts of it do I want to do more of? And you might find through doing that your entire concept for the podcast you wanted to make isn't quite right. Like for me, I thought a lot about bonus content. In the first year of my podcast, I was thinking about Patreon and how to grow that and how to create perks that were more appealing for people. And I had a lot of brainstorming around creating bonus content. And for a while, I thought I wanted to do these solo episodes that were like me riffing on a performance climbing topic, like some lesson that I've learned and, something that I'm thinking about or things along those lines. And I kept stalling. I kept like putting it off and putting it off and putting it off. And finally, I realized it clicked one day. Like, I don't actually want to do that. I find solo episodes to be really hard. They're my least favorite. I would way rather have a conversation with someone or answer questions from people. And I was finding myself answering a lot of people's questions on email. And so that pivoted to Q&A episodes. And those are now part of my Patreon bonus content thing where patrons can submit questions. But yeah, you don't know that sort of thing unless you actually try to make the thing, and then you have so much clarity with that 2020 hindsight.
Well said. I really want to hit this because I don't think it's something we've previously talked about. When looking for options to monetize, and maybe just take some of the cost out of it, or maybe pay for the whole thing, or make some money to do it. It just kind of depends on, your listenership and what people will pay for. We haven't really talked that much about Patreon. Can you tell us a little bit about how that works and how that's been, successful or not successful for you?
Sure. Yeah. Patreon is a monthly donation platform. So it's a website that I signed up for as a creator, and then patrons can sign up, listeners can sign up as donors. And they're basically pledging me a monthly donation to support my work. And it's not just for podcasters. A lot of musicians use this nowadays if they're, self-publishing records and things like that. It just gives you a little bit more autonomy and creative freedom, versus if you're a musician, for instance, being under a record label and having to do what they want you to do. But for podcasting, yeah, I have, I think 450 listeners now that have become patrons and support me on a monthly basis. And you can create your own tiered donation levels. So I have like my $5 per month tier as my entry level, and then I have some higher ones. And you also decide what perks you want to offer at those different tier levels. So for me, the biggest one, like my bread and butter, is I have these weekly episodes that are free, that are the normal podcast with different guests every week. And then at least once or twice a month, I put out a bonus episode that's only for patrons, where I have a guest, an older guest, back on the show, and we do a follow-up conversation, and we talk about their recent climbing, maybe some big climb that they achieved that we had talked about in our first conversation, or some element of, their training or their performance or their mental game or something that's a little bit more in the weeds than we would normally go on the show. And I put out like a free teaser that gives people an idea of what to expect from that episode. And then you have to sign up to get the full thing. So yeah, that's just one example. There's a lot of different ways to do it, but it's worked really well for me. I think there are a few lessons I've learned that I would share for people that are considering that. I mean, a lot of people think of it as just a way for their listeners to donate to them. And I've found that while it's kind of funny, like a lot of people just want to support the regular show, and I'll get emails from them saying like, hey, don't feel stressed about having to put out all this bonus stuff. We just want to support you. But ironically, it was inevitably some bonus conversation that they wanted to listen to that got them to sign up. It got them over that hump of, it's not even the $5 a month. It's more like the inconvenience of having one more subscription and more emails in their inbox, right? So I do think it really helps to brainstorm and to have something that you're selling and to create more value for your listeners and have that be an exchange that you feel really good about. So you can promote it, you can sell it and feel good about saying, hey, if you give me $5 per month, you're getting even more value from me than the normal show.
I'm so glad you used that word. I was just going to bring that up. The value that you are providing, it seems greater than the money that people are spending. Is that's the case, right? I mean, your Patreon seems like it's been very, very successful.
Thanks. Yeah, it feels that way. And of course, it feels really uncomfortable at first. It feels really uncomfortable to ask for money. You kind of feel like a beggar a little bit because everyone expects to get podcasts for free and basically everything on the internet for free these days. But when you have enough people tell you how much they appreciate what you do, when people talk to you on Instagram or in emails or you meet them in person at the cliff. Like I meet a lot of people out climbing these days and they'll just tell me how much they've taken away from the show and how much it's helped them. It gets easier and easier to, I guess over time you internalize that and you realize like, wow, this really is value for people and I'm selling something. I'm not asking for pity. I'm not a beggar asking for loose change. Another thing that really helped actually was a little while ago, I had a feature in Climbing Magazine. They featured me in the podcast. And I can't remember how I stumbled into it, but I saw on their website that they were trying to hire a podcast producer for some podcast that they wanted to make either for climbing or for Outdoor Magazine. They're connected. And they were going to pay that person $50,000 a year. And I read the job description, I guess, and just realized like, wow, that's roughly a third of the things that I do for my own podcast every week, and that really helped me see that, okay, as a society, we do actually put some value on this and it's okay for me to ask for support for this work that I'm doing, even though I absolutely love it and would do it anyway. I'm still working really hard. I'm still creating value and it's okay to ask for a livelihood in exchange for that.
Yeah, that's amazing. So how are you doing the asking? Is it something that's in your outro or just in the show notes? How are you actually getting people to do that?
Yeah, so I currently don't have ads on my podcast, and I actually, we can talk about that. I actually do plan to have ads, but because I don't, I have that extra space and I can ask for support from people. So I do that in the intro, sometimes in the outro. I actually don't do it in every episode, and that's really just because I don't like doing it. It takes more time, it takes more work. And what I've found really works well is, like I said, I put out these free teasers of my bonus conversations. So that exists as this kind of set aside, perfectly positioned sales pitch. I can say, here's what you're about to listen to. This is a sneak peek at this bonus conversation. Here's how to get access to the full thing. And if you like what you're listening to, you can go finish the episode right now. It's easy. It just takes a few minutes to sign up. Here's the link. So I've done it that way. I kind of have these teasers come out that are these little sales pitches for Patreon. And that way, people that already have signed up can just skip those. And they're not, I'm not trying to sell them on something that they've already invested in, which feels good as well.
That's really smart. That's a really brilliant way to do that in a way that's not like super annoying. We've talked about this before too, but like, I get it that people, they want to make money on their podcast and cover their costs and things like that, but they'll advertise things that are like completely unrelated to their show, stuck, 3 or 4 times in the middle of their show. And it's so distracting. I can't really get into doing it that way. But what you're describing seems a lot more organic and natural. And again, you're providing such a high amount of value. It's a low cost thing to jump into. And, if just like that snowball you talked about, if you let it build over time, then, you might be looking at getting all your costs covered. That's amazing.
Totally. Yeah. I have a couple thoughts. One thing that reminds me of that I want to share is that, basically all of the decisions I've made with my show, like how I structure it, how I do the intros, the lack of ads, how I do the Patreon, all of that stuff. It's all of those decisions come from me trying to avoid the things that annoy me in other podcasts. Because I feel the same way. Like whenever you're in a really good flow and it's a great conversation, and then they interrupt the middle of the episode to share an ad for something that you don't want to buy, like I hate that. It totally annoys me. And even though you can skip 15 seconds ahead, press that 4 times, whatever, it still takes away from the flow. And I never wanted to do that. So I just drew that line in the sand for myself. Even if I have ads, I'm never going to do an ad read in the middle of the conversation. I'll do it before, I'll do it after, but never in the middle. That's just my own personal feeling because it annoys me in other podcasts when they do that. And then along that same line of thinking, I think a lot about who I would want to advertise for on the show. And I would want to make sure that those brands or products align with my values. They're things that I think people would actually be excited to hear about, because there are podcasts that I listen to where the ads add value. I'm like, oh, I actually want to go buy that, or I want to check that out, or it's just entertaining because they do a good job and they're funny in their ad read, things along those lines. And then the other thought I had, this is kind of unrelated, but, going back to this idea of creating value in the snowball thing, like you just said, you're totally right. And that's something I hadn't really thought about. But now that I've been doing my Patreon for about a year and doing these follow-ups for about a year, I have 24 follow-ups that people get access to instantly if they sign up. So, that's hours and hours of content that have just grown over time, and it becomes a much easier sell, and that's something I hadn't thought about. I thought I was selling one episode at a time, but you're not. You're really selling this gigantic library, and it's kind of an investment, and it grows over time. And these days, $5 a month for access to, 24 episodes is like kind of a no-brainer. So that's a really powerful thing that I hadn't thought about at the start.
Yeah, that's a really great point. It's like if you sign up for Netflix today, all of a sudden you've got 6 seasons of Schitt's Creek to go binge. Like, booyah! That's great.
Exactly.
That's awesome.
Best $10 you ever spent. Right?
Totally. They didn't have to wait for subsequent seasons like the rest of us schmucks did. Yeah, those are all really good points, and I love that you were so thoughtful about that. And you're right. Like once you create an episode, it's been created and it lives somewhere. And I'm always stunned when people go back and like download an episode, it could be your episode. We did that months ago, but somebody signs up for the podcast today. They've never heard it. Then they go back and find it. And it's so cool to be able to give that as a gift that just kind of keeps on giving, Yeah,
it really is. And when you have a long form conversation with someone, a lot of them feel really evergreen. Even if I'm talking about a specific phase in my life, or if I'm talking to one of my heroes about a specific climb that they're working on, and then they succeed on it later, it's still fascinating. If you're a geeky climber like me, it's still fascinating to go back and to hear them thinking about that stage of the process. So I find that, episodes almost don't really age out. Like I think my first episode with my friend Lizzie it's still just a really interesting conversation for people that haven't heard it yet. And yeah, you really do create this investment. Like you're creating lasting and growing value over time.
I love that. Very well said. When you look at your process, this could be hardware or software. What things do you consider like the top, like most essential things that you use? Again, it could be equipment or it could be software or anything in between.
That's a really good question. It's tough for me to say that because of, we already talked about this. Like, I don't think there's a best way. I think there's a way that I found works really well for me. So for me, that answer would be Logic Pro, because regardless of what's hardware I'm using, regardless of where I'm recording an episode, I've learned to do so much in post-production that I can make up for a lot of that. Having said all that, for someone else, the answer might be completely different because they're not as excited about being a geeky audio producer, So I'll throw out a few other things. I use the Zoom H6 handy recorder for all of my interviews. I have two SM58 microphones and, a few mic cords, and I do all my in-person episodes that way. It's incredibly portable. My entire setup fits in a little duffel bag that I got at a used gear shop. and for remote recordings, I still record my own audio with my SM58 straight into the into the Zoom H6. So my audio is always the same. That was something that I felt was important to me. I really was bothered or just annoyed or confused when I would listen to a podcast and the person's intro, the host, sounded really good and the audio quality was good. And then you would listen to their conversation and they're recording over Zoom with a different microphone and it doesn't sound as good. I was always confused. Like, why are they doing it that way? You can have the exact same audio for your track, at least, all the time. So I do that. And then I have my MacBook. I have an auxiliary cable that goes from my MacBook into the Zoom H6, and then I'm listening to the conversation with headphones from the Zoom H6. So that's my setup. The whole thing costs $600. Wow. I only had to pay for that once, and then, it's still, everything's working great. So I'm so happy I made that investment. Logic Pro is like $200 and it's not a subscription. You just pay for that once and then you're set up. So that personally for me has been a really good investment. And then I'm actually really glad I bought this too. This was a Tim Ferriss recommendation, but I'm talking to you right now on an Audio-Technica ATR2100 USB microphone. And I don't use it for my own episodes. Like I said, I use the SM58 for everything. But for Zoom calls like this, and for being featured on other podcasts, I love this microphone. It's super simple. I just have it going straight into my MacBook. I'm talking to you on the computer. It's, $80, pretty simple. Wow. And it sounds pretty darn good. So,
the quality of the sound that's coming in is phenomenal. I can tell you on my end, like you always sound super crisp and clean, and no difference there. That's awesome. We'll tag all of those things in the show notes. It's so cool that you're able to do this with such a simple setup that doesn't need to break the bank.
Yeah, it's the best. Like, I can walk into someone's house if I'm meeting someone and they say like, "Oh, just come over and we'll record it at my living room table. My kids are gone, whatever." I just pick up a duffel bag and it's super portable. I don't even have to have my laptop because everything records locally onto an SD card. So I can just have a little notebook with some notes, or I'll have my laptop sitting there with, my interview notes for them or things like that. But yeah, I really am happy with the setup. I don't think I plan to change anything anytime soon. And then I'll share a quick story for people. As far as the audio production goes, a few weeks ago, I was in Boulder, Colorado, and I had to take my van into the auto mechanic. I was having trouble with the starter. And for people that have romanticized van life, this is something that you might not have thought about. Like, you have all this freedom. It's amazing. Life's great until you have car problems. And then you very quickly go from like 100 to 0 because you lost your car, you lost your house, all your things are in your house van, and now that's in the shop. So, it can kind of leave you stranded.
That's a good point. I never thought of that.
Right. Right. And I had an interview scheduled that day, and maybe I should have rescheduled it, but I decided to just go for it. So I carried my little duffel bag down the street to the Whole Foods, and I recorded a 2-hour podcast sitting in the courtyard outside of this Whole Foods. And there was a lot of background noise, a lot of stuff going on. But I knew, based on the skills that I've learned in Logic Pro and, learning how to cut out background noises and things along those lines, I knew I'd be able to make it work, and it turned out great. So,
Wow.
If you are the type of person who, and for people listening, you can check out the episode I did with Tom Herbert. I think it's episode 92 of the Nugget, if you want to hear that one, so you can hear the sound quality. But yeah, if you're an audio geek like me and you're interested in learning about this stuff, I think that's one of the greatest investments I've made in myself, is taking the time to research plugins and get really, really good at the sound production side, because it just gives you so much freedom in your recording.
What advice would you give to somebody like me who is not an audio geek, who has no experience, with audio production, and therefore, has to pay? I have to pay like a service to do processing for me. What advice would you say to somebody like me? Like, is Logic Pro easy to use, or is it something you should just invest in and get really good at and practice for a lot of hours? Like what advice would you give there?
I don't know if I would advise you to change anything, honestly. I mean, if that sounds interesting to you and it sounds, and if you'd enjoyed learning about that, then go for it. But I think you did a really smart thing. Like I've talked with a couple other podcasters. I'm actually producing someone else's podcast right now, because they're like you. They just don't want to deal with it. They want to have the conversations. They want to hand it off to someone else, and they want to just be able to forget about it, because they have all these other things going on. It's actually 2 women that host another climbing podcast, and they're both total badass climbers. They're both way stronger than me. And one of them's a professional coach. They're both professional climbers. And, they just have a lot of other stuff going on. So for them, handing it off to someone else is the right thing to do. And for you, I think if you're happy with this service that you're investing in, I mean, your podcast sounds great. It sounds certainly good enough that no one's being distracted by the audio quality. And I think people listening, just find whatever you need to do to accomplish that. You can do it all yourself. Absolutely. There's a lot of resources on the internet. You can learn everything you need to know about Logic Pro on YouTube. If you have more questions, you can reach out to me, and I'm happy to do a coaching call. But if you don't want to learn all that stuff, you can use Zencaster, and you can find one of these third-party groups or softwares that package everything for you and make it really easy. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that at all.
Cool. Yeah, that's really great advice. Do you have any other advice that you would give somebody who is wanting to start a podcast?
Now there's the 5 seconds of silence while I collect my thoughts. It's hard because there's so many different things, and it really depends on the person, I guess one more thing that comes to mind, I think one of the best decisions I made was to commit to a weekly schedule of putting out an episode every Monday. And it by no means has to be that schedule, but I think just deciding like what is the consistency with which you want to show up and do this thing, and then sticking to it. I think there's a tremendous amount of value in that, because so many people, there's this entire elephant's graveyard of podcasts, right? That have started, they do 3 episodes, and then you never hear from them again. That's such a common story. And I think, for me, committing to just showing up every Monday and putting out a new episode, and I don't know if I had a set amount that I wanted to do, but I knew I was going to do at least half a dozen episodes. If you do that, you learn so much and you build so much momentum through that process. Then you'll have an idea of whether or not you want to stick with it or not. You'll have an idea of whether or not you enjoy it or not. But it'd be really easy for me to go a month between episodes if I hadn't created that arbitrary obligation for myself,
Yeah.
And now people expect it. They expect an episode every Monday. And it got me really excited to think that, when people start their work week and they have to go back to work, they have at least something to look forward to on Monday morning. And that keeps me honest, like I live on the road, I can climb full time now, and I still work, 20 to 40 hours a week because I want to show up every Monday for people. That's been really powerful for me. It's given me a lot of structure that I find really helpful. It's kind of that like Steven Pressfield idea of choosing to be a pro, just show up and put the time in and do the work, even when you don't necessarily feel like it. I think if you love what you do, you shouldn't feel like you're forcing it or like you have to do it. But you don't, I don't always feel like editing an episode, that can feel like quite a grind sometimes. But when it's all said and done, I feel really proud of that content that comes out every Monday morning. And I feel really, I do really love it.
That's great. Yeah. It's like Pressfield says, like if you're a writer and it's 9 a.m. on a Tuesday, it doesn't matter whether it's raining or whether you want to or not, like you're writing. That's what you do. I love that.
Exactly.
I love that. Two of my favorite podcasts, The Forward by Lance Armstrong and The Drive by Peter Attia. I love The Forward podcast, but it's so inconsistent. He'll go months without doing an episode. And I find that to be a little annoying where, The Drive comes out every Monday. And even if it's a shorter episode, I know on Monday there will be an episode there. And I really like and appreciate that. So I think that is really great advice and a really great way to close out this conversation. Where can people go to find you and find your podcast?
Yeah, again, it's the Nugget Climbing Podcast. You can find it anywhere where you're listening to podcasts, including wherever you're listening to this one right now, likely on your podcast app. Just type in The Nugget. It'll pop right up. You can also go to thenuggetclimbing.com. I have all my episodes and my show notes over there, and you can learn a little bit more about me if you want to. And then I'm pretty active on Instagram. That's the main place where I show up every day and interact with people and answer questions from people and things along those lines. So that is at the Nugget Climbing on Instagram. So yeah, those are the main places, and new episodes every Monday.
That's great. We will link to all of that in the show notes. Steven Dimmitt, thank you so much. This was such a fun conversation. I've really been looking forward to this. And it is cool to talk to somebody who, again, just the most pure intentions of having a show, and to watch it succeed and to watch you get improve your craft over time has just been so cool. So thank you so much for all your work and for appearing on our show.
Always a pleasure, Casey. Thanks for having me back. And anytime, man, anytime you want to chat, I'm always up for it.
Thank you for listening to the How to Make a Podcast podcast. If you enjoyed the episode, please leave us a rating and review on Apple. Also, be sure to check out the show that made all of this possible, Boundless Body Radio, where we provide tons of helpful and informative content, feature incredible guests, and talk all about health and wellness. Cheers, and thank you for joining us on the How to Make a Podcast podcast.